Marcus Walker was just an ordinary guy living in the south side of Chicago, juggling two jobs to keep the lights on and feed his family. But one fateful night, a routine drive home turned into a nightmare when a hot-headed cop pulled him over with no explanation. Officer Brad Maxwell, well known for his harsh tactics, accused Marcus of a crime he didn't commit. Within minutes, Marcus found himself in handcuffs, terrified and utterly confused. Little did he know that this unjust arrest would lead to a jaw-dropping court battle that would expose corruption, test his resolve, and leave an entire city speechless. The wind whipped through the tall buildings of downtown Chicago as Marcus Walker drove home from his late shift at a local warehouse. His eyes were tired, and he was looking forward to a warm meal and a few hours of rest before returning to his second job at a neighborhood grocery store. Marcus was a proud father of 3 kids, twins in middle school, and a younger son who had just started first grade. Life was hectic, but precious to him. The moment he saw flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror, a wave of dread swept over him. Everyone in his neighborhood knew encounters with certain police officers could be fraught with peril, especially for a black man driving alone at night. Marcus pulled over, rolled down his window, and tried to keep his nerves in check. The officer who approached had a menacing air about him. Tall and muscular with a shaved head, he flashed a stern look that brooked no kindness. Marcus recognized him from local gossip, Officer Brad Maxwell. Rumor had it, Maxwell had a habit of harassing people of color, often on the flimsiest of pretexts. The tension in the air felt razor sharp. License and registration, barked Maxwell. His voice was cold. Marcus handed over his driver's license and the vehicle registration, trying to calm his mounting anxiety. Maxwell shone a flashlight directly into Marcus's eyes, as if searching for signs of guilt, or maybe just a reason to escalate. Seconds stretched into minutes, while Maxwell scrutinized every inch of the car. Marcus could sense something was off. It was after midnight, and traffic was light. There was no apparent reason for Maxwell to have pulled him over. "You know why I stopped you?" Maxwell asked with a sneer. "No, sir," Marcus replied. "I wasn't speeding, and all my lights are working." Maxwell leaned forward, the beam of the flashlight still dancing across the dashboard. "I'll ask the questions here," he snapped. Marcus did his best to remain calm, but when Maxwell demanded that he step out of the car, adrenaline spiked in Marcus's veins. He thought about his family, about how missing even one day of work could set them back. He wanted to avoid any confrontation, but Maxwell's tone rattled him. It wasn't just the tension of the moment. It was the feeling of being targeted, singled out for reasons that had nothing to do with traffic law. Maxwell reached for his cuffs in a swift, practiced motion and barked at Marcus to place his hands behind his back. Before Marcus could even protest, the cold steel clicked around his wrists. Terror and confusion consumed him. He could feel his heart pounding. Across the street, a few curious onlookers peered out of their apartment windows. Marcus felt a surge of humiliation and helplessness. "What am I being arrested for?" Marcus managed to ask, choking back panic. Maxwell's lip curled. "Suspicion of burglary," he replied without missing a beat. "We've had reports in this area." Marcus's voice shook. "But I was just driving home from work. I haven't committed any crime." Maxwell ignored him. He patted Marcus down with unnecessary roughness and yanked him to the squad car. The tension in the air was palpable. In the distance, the shrill cry of sirens could be heard, blending into the everyday city noise. Marcus felt as if he were in a nightmare, powerless to stop any of it. In the harsh glow of the streetlights, everything around him took on a surreal, washed-out hue. The reality of the arrest, unjust and arbitrary, hit him full force. He thought about his kids waiting at home, about the rent that was due next week, and about the precarious balancing act that was his life. At that moment, Marcus knew this wasn't going to be just a humiliating inconvenience. This was something bigger, something that threatened to topple his entire world. Locked up in the back of Maxwell's squad car, Marcus tried to gather his thoughts. He'd never been in trouble with the law before his record was spotless. Yet there he was, chained like a criminal, his body trembling as the squad car lurched and swerved down the main avenue. At the station, things went from bad to worse. Maxwell led him through the fluorescent-lit halls, past rows of desks and guarded stairs. Paperwork was filled out by bored clerks who didn't care to ask questions or check the facts. Every step hammered home a terrifying truth. Marcus could easily slip through the cracks in a system that often presumed guilt before innocence, especially for a black man. Marcus was frisked again, processed, and thrown into a holding cell. Hours passed in that cold, cramped space. The steel bench pressed into his back, and the stale odor of too many detainees hung in the air. Every minute felt like a year. Marcus's mind reeled with worry for his family. By the time dawn broke, he'd only managed a few minutes of fitful sleep. It wasn't until the next morning that he was told he could call a lawyer. He dialed the number of an acquaintance, a community activist named Cynthia James. She wasn't a lawyer, but knew people who worked at the local chapter of the ACLU. She promised to reach out immediately and help find him an attorney. Marcus clung to that thread of hope like a lifeline. Despite his desperation, he refused to let fear consume him. He reminded himself, "I did nothing wrong. The truth will come out." But as the station bustled with the start of a new day, Officer Maxwell was already spinning a web of lies to justify the arrest. He was determined to make the charges stick. After all, letting Marcus go scot-free would mean admitting to an unjust arrest a risk Maxwell wasn't willing to take. 2 days later, Marcus finally stood before a judge for his bail hearing. He was exhausted, disheveled, and overwhelmed by a sense of unreality. The judge glanced at the flimsy police report, which claimed Marcus had been loitering in a high-crime area and had matched the description of a recent burglar. Officer Maxwell's name was scrawled across the pages, with allegations that seemed riddled with inconsistencies. Though the judge seemed skeptical, the system functioned like a conveyor belt. People with means and the right connections might be able to dodge these situations quickly. But for someone like Marcus, it was a fight at every step. Bail was set at an amount that Marcus could barely afford, forcing him to scrape together money from friends and family. It was a humiliating, draining ordeal, but he managed to post bail, an immediate victory that felt more like a temporary reprieve. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't clamoring for interviews. The world, it seemed, didn't notice or care. But one person did. A young public defender named Erica Stevenson had been assigned to Marcus's case initially, before a more seasoned civil rights attorney, Tom Reynolds, took a personal interest. Through the ACLU connection, Cynthia had brought Marcus's case to Tom's attention, and Tom recognized a pattern. He had seen Officer Maxwell's name come up in other questionable arrests, and it stank of racial bias. Tom explained the plan to Marcus. "We're going to challenge the charges aggressively. We're going to investigate Maxwell's history and see if there's a pattern of misconduct. If the truth is on our side, we'll shine a light on it." Marcus nodded, relief warring with residual fear in his eyes. He had never set foot in a courtroom except for jury duty, and now his freedom depended on legal strategies and evidence. It felt as though his life was spinning on an axis he couldn't control. While Marcus struggled to restore some normalcy to his life, returning to his 2 jobs and trying to explain to his children why he'd been gone, Officer Brad Maxwell continued his daily routine, fueled by a swagger that came from years of unchecked authority. Maxwell boasted to colleagues about making the big bust, painting Marcus as a suspicious character. Some officers nodded in approval. Others, sensing the troubling undercurrent, kept their distance. In the days that followed, Tom Reynolds and his small legal team dug deep. They interviewed witnesses who had been stopped by Maxwell and discovered a string of similar complaints. Over and over, young men of color had described sudden, baseless arrests or near arrests at Maxwell's hands. Most were too scared or too resigned to file official grievances. It was Chicago's South Side, After all, a place where trust in law enforcement was already at an all-time low. A breakthrough came when a store owner, Miss S. Campbell, revealed she had surveillance footage from her corner shop that captured the exact time. Maxwell claimed he witnessed Marcus loitering. The grainy video showed clearly that Marcus hadn't even been near that area at the alleged time. He'd been inside her store, purchasing a few snacks for the kids on his way home from work. The timestamp on the receipt matched the video, which gave Marcus a bulletproof alibi for the specific time window cited in the police report. Tom felt a surge of excitement. If the prosecution insisted on pursuing these false charges, they would be met with rock-solid evidence that Maxwell had lied. And if they discovered Maxwell had doctored the arrest report or fabricated reasons for probable cause, Marcus could not only walk free, but also sue the city. Yet they all knew it wouldn't be that simple. The blue wall of silence was infamous for protecting officers, and Maxwell, cunning as he was, would likely have an explanation ready. He might claim a mix-up in timing or confusion under stress. Sometimes these excuses worked in court, and the officer would walk away with little more than a reprimand. As the pre-trial hearings approached, tension simmered. Maxwell's attorney tried to negotiate behind closed doors, suggesting that Marcus accept a plea deal with minimal probation to avoid a potentially harsher sentence. The implication was clear: fight this and risk losing everything. But Marcus, backed by Tom, Cynthia, and his family, refused to admit to a crime he hadn't committed. A swirl of rumors circulated through the courthouse corridors. Some said Maxwell was going to produce irrefutable evidence against Marcus. Others claimed Maxwell was panicking behind the scenes, bullying certain witnesses to toe the line. Tom prepared for the worst and continued his investigation. The Chicago Tribune got wind of the story, especially once Tom reached out and provided evidence of possible police misconduct. A reporter named Sarah Whitfield came to interview Marcus at a local community center. She was a seasoned journalist who had covered police misconduct in Chicago for years. She listened intently, took notes, and promised to run a piece if her editors deemed it newsworthy. But it was a crowded news cycle, and stories like Marcus's happened far too often, rarely making front-page headlines unless something truly explosive was uncovered. Despite the challenges, the community rallied around Marcus. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers who heard the details of his arrest donated small sums to help with legal fees. When Marcus walked down his block, people came up to shake his hand or give him a pat on the shoulder, expressing solidarity in a way that sometimes moved him to tears. It was a bittersweet comfort, heartening to see compassion, but sobering that such acts of solidarity were necessary at all. When the day of the first pretrial hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. Judge Harriet Morales presided, her reputation for fairness and impartiality well known. As Marcus took his seat at the defendant's table, he noticed Maxwell, decked out in his uniform, looking smug on the other side. The prosecutor, a stiff-faced man named Howard Collins, laid out the charges in a monotonous drone. The burglary claim still loomed, though no concrete evidence tying Marcus to any actual break-in had surfaced. Instead, the prosecutor pointed to Maxwell's statement, claiming Marcus had been acting suspicious and fled the scene of a nearby attempted burglary. Tom rose to speak. In precise, calm tones, he dissected Maxwell's timeline, using the store security footage as a linchpin to prove that Marcus was nowhere near the alleged crime scene. The gallery buzzed with murmurs as Tom revealed how the timestamps contradicted Maxwell's account. Judge Morales glanced over her reading glasses at the footage and asked pointed questions, her voice indicating she found the discrepancies troubling. Collins tried to pivot. "We believe Officer Maxwell simply noted the wrong time in his statement, Your Honor. We have additional witnesses who place Mr. Walker near the site in question earlier that evening. This new evidence will be presented at trial." A wave of apprehension swept over Marcus. Who were these so-called additional witnesses? Maxwell must have been pressuring people into giving false statements. Yet, if they had legitimate witnesses, that could complicate the case. The hearing concluded with no immediate resolution, but the judge did instruct the prosecution to provide detailed discovery to the defense, including the names of these witnesses. Outside the courthouse, Maxwell strode past Marcus with a smug grin. "You're going down," the cop muttered under his breath, making sure no one else could hear. Marcus stared after him, determination burning in his chest. He'd come too far to be intimidated now. Over the next few weeks, Tom Reynolds worked tirelessly with his legal associates to identify the mysterious witnesses the prosecution intended to call. The initial shock wore off when they uncovered that one of the so-called witnesses was a known informant who'd exchanged testimony for leniency. In his own case, a tactic often used but rarely so transparently. The other supposed witness turned out to be an older man with poor vision who lived 2 blocks away. He'd reportedly seen someone matching Marcus's description, though he'd never mentioned Marcus's name explicitly. Meanwhile, new cracks formed in Maxwell's armor. Off the record, a sergeant in the precinct discreetly tipped Tom off that Maxwell had been disciplined before, albeit lightly, for questionable stops in predominantly black neighborhoods. However, no official records were readily accessible. Internal investigations often remained sealed or heavily redacted. Still, the knowledge was invaluable. It suggested that Maxwell's behavior was part of a pattern and not a one-time lapse. To gather more evidence, Tom enlisted the help of private investigator Sophia Nichols. She conducted interviews with people Maxwell had arrested over the years. She found a man who claimed Maxwell planted a small bag of drugs in his car during a routine stop. The man spent 4 months locked up before the charges were mysteriously dropped. Another woman tearfully recounted how Maxwell had threatened to charge her son with assault if she didn't hand over information about a local gang member, information she didn't even possess. Her son ended up in juvenile detention for 3 months until a lawyer challenged the flimsy charges. Sophia documented each harrowing story, organizing them into a folder that read like a damning indictment of Maxwell's alleged abuses of power. If even half of these accounts held up in court, it would be an earthquake for the police department. Yet there was a risk. A judge might consider these stories irrelevant or inadmissible as evidence against Maxwell, unless a pattern of malicious prosecution or racial profiling could be directly linked to Marcus's case. So Tom proceeded carefully, knowing that reputations and lives hung in the balance. In the midst of this uphill legal battle, Marcus tried to keep his life from unraveling. His employer at the grocery store held his position, but the missed days in jail and at court hearings cost him shifts. Money was tight, the kids needed new shoes, and the landlord was growing impatient about the rent. Marcus's wife, Lillian, picked up extra hours at her cleaning job. The stress weighed heavily on their marriage, as arguments flared over finances, fear of the future, and the emotional toll of fighting a system that felt so much bigger than them. Marcus's parents, both retired, came by often to cook meals and watch the children when Lillian worked late. This small circle of familial love was the bedrock holding Marcus together. He found strength in their unwavering support. Late at night, he prayed for a miracle or at least some semblance of relief. He repeated the phrase, "The truth will come out," like a mantra. But doubt gnawed at him. What if it didn't? What if the system swallowed him whole, as it had done to so many others? Anxiety skyrocketed. Whenever Marcus saw a police car in the neighborhood, he felt an irrational urge to run, though he'd done nothing wrong. The emotional damage from that night of the arrest lingered. At times, he'd catch himself trembling behind the wheel of his own car, haunted by the memory of flashing lights. Yet adversity galvanized him too. He began speaking up at community meetings, sharing his story. It was therapeutic to voice his experiences and hear others share theirs. Cynthia James, the community activist who initially helped him contact an attorney, suggested that they hold a small rally outside the courthouse on the day of his trial. Marcus wasn't sure he wanted that kind of attention, but he realized it might be the very thing needed to bring more eyes and scrutiny to a flawed system. A measure of accountability could arise from public pressure. On a bright, chilly morning, Marcus's trial finally began. Dozens of supporters, many holding signs demanding justice, gathered outside the courthouse. Some banners read, "Stop racial profiling," and "Justice for Marcus Walker." News cameras snapped pictures, capturing the crowd's diverse faces: black, white, Hispanic, Asian, young, and old, united by outrage at how easily an innocent man could be thrown into the maw of the justice system. Inside, tension crackled in the air. The prosecutor's case hinged on Maxwell's testimony and the two shaky witnesses. Maxwell took the stand first, wearing his uniform and exuding a feigned confidence. He recounted the night in question as if reading from a script. He claimed he'd received a tip about a potential burglary in the area and saw Marcus lurking near the building in question. When asked about the discrepancies in the timeline, Maxwell affected surprise, stating he must have noted the time incorrectly due to the stress of the situation. He insisted he had no doubt about Marcus's presence and suspicious behavior. Tom Reynolds rose to cross-examine him. The courtroom grew so silent that every creak of a wooden bench echoed. Tom's questions were relentless yet calm. He asked Maxwell to explain how the security footage showed Marcus in the corner store at exactly the moment. Maxwell insisted he was prowling around an adjacent building. Maxwell squirmed, feigning confusion. He claimed that Marcus must have left the store earlier or returned after the burglary attempt. His answers were riddled with contradictions. Tom pressed him on the police report's wording, highlighting how none of it mentioned a tip or suspicious behavior beyond a single vague sentence. When Tom introduced the store receipt into evidence, time-stamped and matching the video, Maxwell glared at him, visibly rattled. But the veteran cop refused to relent, doubling down with claims that some criminals are crafty enough to set up alibis in advance. The prosecutor quickly moved to redirect, but the damage was done. Anyone paying attention could see the holes in Maxwell's story. The prosecution then called their first witness, a wiry man in his mid-30s named Hector Jimenez. Hector had a record for petty theft and admitted he was on probation. He claimed, under oath, that he saw Marcus near the burglarized building that night. When Tom cross-examined him, Hector admitted he'd made a deal with the prosecutor's office for a reduced sentence on a pending charge in exchange for his testimony. The air in the courtroom turned thick with unspoken suspicion. Hector's credibility was reduced to tatters. Next came the older man with poor eyesight, Mr. Davenport. He seemed genuinely confused, offering contradictory statements about the color of the suspect's shirt and the time he supposedly saw him. At one point, he mumbled that the police had shown him a photograph, which influenced his recollection. Tom seized on that detail, questioning whether the police had led him to identify Marcus. "Mr. Davenport stammered, "I suppose they did, but I can't be sure." The courtroom buzzed again. Then, it was the defense's turn to present their case in earnest. Tom called on Miss S. Campbell from the corner store. She testified about Marcus's frequent visits and how he had come in that night, just before closing, to buy snacks. Her store's security footage was played again, the timestamp displaying a crystal-clear contradiction to Maxwell's account. In the front row, supporters nodded vigorously. Even some jurors exchanged looks of concern. Tom then played a surprising card. He called the private investigator, Sophia Nichols, who had interviewed multiple alleged victims of Maxwell's misconduct. Though the prosecutor objected to relevance, Judge Morales allowed limited testimony to establish a pattern. Sophia spoke methodically, referencing dates and details where Maxwell's stories had collapsed under scrutiny. She stopped short of revealing every ugly detail, but the message was clear. Maxwell had a history of questionable arrests disproportionately targeting people of color. Finally, Marcus took the stand in his own defense. He spoke quietly but firmly, recounting the night of his arrest, the fear and shock he felt, and his absolute certainty that he had done nothing suspicious. He described his daily life: 2 jobs, 3 children, a wife waiting at home, emphasizing that he had no motive, no opportunity, and certainly no reason to commit burglary. His authenticity shone through. After closing arguments, The jury filed out to deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was so thick, it felt like a living thing. Marcus's hands trembled as he clutched Lillian's. A hush came over the room when they returned far sooner than expected an hour later. Everyone braced for the verdict. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and announced the decision, not guilty on all counts. For a moment, the room was still, as if everyone collectively held their breath. Then an uproar of relief and applause broke out among Marcus's supporters. Tears streamed down Lillian's cheeks as she threw her arms around her husband. Outside, the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps, cheering for the outcome. News cameras flashed again, capturing the raw emotion of that moment. Officer Maxwell, meanwhile, sat stone-faced. He had lost, and it was obvious. But the shock that came next was something no one in that courtroom anticipated. The judge spoke in a measured tone. Given the troubling contradictions in Officer Maxwell's testimony and the strong possibility of deliberate fabrication, I'm recommending this matter for further investigation by Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. A stunned silence followed. The judge was essentially inviting a federal inquiry. That was the hard karma blow that would soon gather momentum. Maxwell's attorney frantically tried to salvage the situation, but the seeds of accountability had been planted. In that single moment, Maxwell's grim expression betrayed a flash of panic. He understood the tide had turned against him. The media exploded with the story. Local news stations played clips from the trial. The Chicago Tribune released an in-depth article describing Marcus's ordeal and the mounting allegations against Maxwell. Social media lit up with discussions and debates about police reform, racial profiling, and the ways in which innocent people could be entrapped by the very institutions sworn to protect them. Marcus and Tom were invited to speak at a community forum, where they were joined by civil rights activists and local politicians. Television cameras captured the moment Tom declared, "We're taking this further. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest. It's about a broken system. Officer Maxwell is not an anomaly, he's a symptom of a deeper problem." Applause thundered from the crowd. Within days, the Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Unit launched an investigation into Maxwell's conduct. The Department of Justice opened a separate inquiry into potential civil rights violations, placing Maxwell and potentially other officers under a legal microscope. Whispers circulated that Maxwell had already begun calling in favors, hoping to escape severe punishment. But the public outcry was strong, and the facts of Marcus's case were difficult to ignore. Maxwell's past misconduct complaints were unsealed, revealing a scathing pattern of intimidation and racial bias. Despite the storm, or perhaps because of it, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm. Yes, the trauma lingered, and there would be more battles ahead. He wanted an apology, restitution for the stress inflicted, and assurances that no other innocent person would endure the same horror. But for the first time since that harrowing night, he felt validated. The system, though lumbering and imperfect, had finally listened. As the investigations progressed, Maxwell found himself besieged by lawsuits. More victims came forward, emboldened by Marcus's win. Some had quietly settled with the city in the past, but now they were eager to speak publicly, determined to expose the officer who had ruined lives with impunity. The police union tried to shield Maxwell, providing legal counsel and spinning a narrative about a decorated officer being smeared. But the evidence stacking up against him was daunting. Karma hit Maxwell harder when he was placed on unpaid suspension, pending the outcome of the investigations. Stripped of his badge and gun, he sulked in his small suburban home, forced to watch the news coverage that painted him in an increasingly damning light. Reporters pressed him for interviews, but his attorney advised silence. His neighbors, once friendly, eyed him warily. The alliances he had counted on within the department began to fracture as others tried to distance themselves from the scandal. Meanwhile, Marcus's life took an unexpected turn for the better. The grocery store offered him a managerial position, partly in recognition of his integrity and resilience. Local nonprofits raised funds to help cover his court costs, and a civil rights organization recognized him with an award for standing up against injustice. The moment that had threatened to tear his life apart ultimately brought new opportunities and a sense of purpose he never imagined. He wasn't out for revenge. What he wanted was systemic change. Working alongside Tom and Cynthia James, he participated in workshops and speaking engagements to advocate for greater accountability in law enforcement. His children, once frightened by their father's ordeal, looked at him with admiration for his bravery. Lillian grew closer to him through the shared hardship, their marriage weathering the storm. Months passed, and the federal investigation concluded with a damning report. Maxwell faced multiple charges: perjury, civil rights violations, and filing false police reports. His attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal to reduce jail time, but the push for justice was strong, buoyed by public sentiment. In a second courtroom drama, Maxwell stood trial. Witness after witness testified to his pattern of aggression, racism, and outright fabrication of evidence. Marcus was called to testify about his own experience. Standing before the court, he felt a swirl of nerves and righteous anger. He recounted, once more, the details of that frightening night. Unlike before, this time the seats were filled with journalists, representatives from the ACLU, members of his own community, and even some from the broader Chicago area who had taken an interest in the case. The weight of it all was immense, but Marcus's steady voice left no doubt about the truth. In the end, a second jury delivered a verdict: guilty. The judge sentenced Maxwell to time in federal prison and mandated restitution to some of his victims. While no punishment could fully undo the harm he'd caused, the message sent was powerful and undeniable. Outside that courthouse, Marcus stood beneath the bright sun, flanked by friends and community members who had championed his cause. Reporters thrust microphones into his face, asking how he felt. Marcus took a moment, collecting his thoughts, then answered with quiet conviction, "I feel relief, but this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been profiled or arrested unfairly. This is a step toward justice, but we have a long way to go." In the wake of Maxwell's conviction, seismic changes rippled through the Chicago Police Department. Internal Affairs stepped up their oversight of officers with prior complaints, and new training programs were introduced focusing on anti-bias education and community outreach. Though cynics warned that such measures were window dressing, potentially more symbolic than transformative, a shift in public discourse was evident. Voices in the community grew louder, demanding transparency, demanding reform, and demanding that the old ways of turning a blind eye to misconduct be dismantled. Marcus became a face of that movement, albeit reluctantly. He never sought the spotlight, but he recognized the power of testimony. Invitations poured in from colleges, civic organizations, and even local police departments wanting to rebuild trust. He spoke passionately about humanizing one another and the need for empathy, accountability, and justice. The settlement from the city, finalized after Maxwell's conviction, allowed Marcus and Lillian to buy a modest home in a safer neighborhood. They still worked hard. Marcus maintained his grocery store job, while Lillian continued her cleaning business, but a heavy burden of financial insecurity lifted. Their children excelled in school, inspired by their parents' resilience. The older twins began exploring activism in their own ways, organizing small school programs that encouraged dialogues on race and policing. For Tom Reynolds, the case of Marcus Walker became a landmark in his legal career. He received a flood of requests from potential clients, many who had stories eerily similar to Marcus's. Tom expanded his practice, partnering with other civil rights lawyers to tackle systemic issues. He credited Marcus's courageous stand for shining a spotlight on these injustices and emboldening more victims to come forward. In one poignant moment, about a year after Maxwell's conviction, Marcus visited a youth center in Southside Chicago, accompanied by Cynthia James. Dozens of teenagers, mostly Black and Hispanic, sat in a circle as Marcus recounted his journey. When he finished, a young boy, barely in his teens, raised his hand. Did you ever think about fighting back? Like, not with lawyers, but, physically? Marcus paused. He recalled the terror, the indignity of being cuffed on a sidewalk for doing nothing wrong. I understand that anger, he said softly, but fighting violence with violence only gives them the excuse they're looking for. My fight was in court, showing the world that I was innocent. Don't get me wrong, it took everything in me to stay calm. But when the truth came out, it spoke louder than any punch I could have thrown. The boy nodded, a thoughtful frown on his face. Marcus could see a spark of something, hope maybe. Perhaps that single glimmer would keep another young man from making a choice that could ruin his life. Chicago's skyline glowed one late afternoon when Marcus drove through the neighborhood where it all began. He parked near that same corner store, stepping inside to greet Miss S. Campbell. The memory of that night still sent a chill down his spine. Yet now, as he stood in the warm lighting of the store, exchanging pleasantries with Miss S. Campbell, there was a sense of closure. She jokingly offered him a lifetime discount on snacks, and they shared a hearty laugh, reflecting on how far things had come since that dreadful night. Outside, the sky blushed in shades of orange and pink. Marcus leaned against his car for a moment, letting the evening breeze brush against his face. The symbolism wasn't lost on him, like the day turning to night, only to give way to morning. Life, too, could spiral into darkness and still find its way back to the light. His phone buzzed, a text from Lillian, reminding him to pick up groceries for dinner. He smiled. Ordinary tasks now felt like blessings. He glanced at the street where Maxwell had pulled him over. A year ago, he'd have been overcome by bitterness, but now a calm certainty flowed through him. He wasn't defined by that trauma. If anything, it had spurred him to become stronger, more outspoken, and committed to change. As he started his car and pulled onto the road, Marcus whispered to himself, "We're going to be all right." And deep down, he believed it. And so ends the unforgettable story of Marcus Walker, a man who became the catalyst for justice and change in a system riddled with racial bias and systemic flaws. His courage in the face of injustice, backed by the steadfast support of his family, community, and a dedicated legal team, turned a harrowing ordeal into a powerful movement for reform. Officer Maxwell's downfall wasn't just individual karma. It signaled a broader reckoning. Through it all, Marcus emerged stronger, his life a testament to resilience and hope. If this powerful story moved you, if you felt Marcus's fear, anger, and ultimate triumph, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By spreading his story, you help shine a light on injustice and inspire more people to stand up for what's right. Together, we can bring about the change our communities so desperately need. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories of truth and justice.